Welcome to Cozy Jury. Tonight's story will test you. It's messy, it's complicated, and by the end, you will decide who's right and who's wrong. But before we begin, if you value what we're building here, hit like. Subscribe if you want more of this, but only if this is your kind of content. I'd rather earn it than beg for it. Drop a comment. Where are you right now and what time is it?
I love knowing who's out there deliberating with us. Now get comfortable. You're not just listening, you're the jury. The fire's burning, the case is open. Let's begin. Andres Ordóñez woke to the sound of his landline ringing at 1 a.m. The shrill electronic pulse cut through the darkness of his bedroom in Chicago's North Side neighborhood.
Where he'd lived alone for 4 years in a house that once held laughter and warmth, but now only echoed with silence. The phone sat on his nightstand, its green LED display glowing like a malevolent eye in the blackness. He'd been dreaming of Marta, his late wife, the way he often did, sitting together on the porch swing they'd installed 30 years ago. In the dream, she was telling him something important, something he needed to remember, but the ringing phone yanked him away before he could grasp it. His hand fumbled for the receiver. The wood floor was cold beneath his feet as he sat up, heart already hammering with that particular dread that comes with late-night calls. Nothing good happens at 1 a.m. That's when hospitals call. That's when police officers show up at doors. That's when the worst news of your life arrives, wrapped in apologetic tones and careful words. He'd received those calls before. 4 years ago, 2 calls within 6 months had destroyed his world entirely. First Marta, a sudden stroke while she slept beside him. Then Camila, his only daughter, a car accident on the Kennedy Expressway during an October rainstorm. He lifted the receiver. Static crackled. Then a voice, so faint he had to press the phone hard against his ear. "Daddy!" The word stopped his breath. Not the voice of a stranger, not a wrong number. The voice was young, feminine, trembling with cold. The voice carried the same slight lisp on the S that Camilla had never quite lost, even as an adult. The voice had the same musical quality, the same cadence she'd inherited from Marta's side of the family. "Daddy, I'm so cold. Please open the door. I'm outside and I can't get in." Andres couldn't speak. His throat had closed. The room tilted slightly, the way it does when you stand up too fast or when reality suddenly refuses to behave the way it should. The voice continued, smaller now, more desperate. "Please, Daddy, it's freezing out here. I need you to let me in." The connection went dead. The dial tone hummed in his ear, steady and indifferent. He sat there holding the phone for what might have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes. He couldn't tell. Time had become elastic, stretching and contracting in ways that made no sense. His hands were shaking so badly that when he finally set the receiver back in its cradle, it took 3 attempts. This is what Andres walked into. This is where our case begins. A phone call in the dead of night, in a quiet house on the north side of Chicago, where a 68-year-old man heard his dead daughter's voice asking to come inside from the cold. The evidence is simple. The implications are impossible. And yet here we are, because what happened next turned Andres's life into a crime scene of a different kind, where the violations weren't physical but psychological, where the victim and the perpetrator might be the same person, and where the truth became something you couldn't trust your own senses to deliver. He stood up from the bed, his legs unsteady. The hardwood floor creaked under his weight. He'd lived in this house for 42 years. He knew every sound it made, every groan of the pipes, every rattle of the windows when the wind came off Lake Michigan. He knew the difference between the house settling and something else. Right now he heard nothing but his own breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. His mind was racing, trying to catalogue explanations. A prank call. Someone's sick idea of a joke. But who would do that? Who even knew about Camilla's death anymore? 4 years was long enough that people stopped bringing her up in conversation, stopped asking how he was doing. The sympathy casseroles had stopped coming 3.5 years ago. Even his neighbors, Teresa and Rogelio, who'd been kind in the beginning, had moved on to treating him with a sort of careful normalcy, the way you treat someone fragile who you're trying not to break. But the voice, God, the voice. It wasn't just similar to Camilla's, it was exact. It had the same warmth underneath the fear, the same way she'd said daddy when she was little and scared of thunderstorms, climbing into bed between him and Marta, her small body shivering until she felt safe. He walked to the window. His bedroom faced the front yard, and through the gap in the curtains he could see the street below. The sodium vapor streetlights cast everything in shades of orange and shadow. His front porch was visible, the wooden steps he'd repaired last summer, the welcome mat Marta had chosen, now faded and worn. There was nothing there. No figure standing in the cold. No daughter waiting to be let in. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. His breath fogged it up. Part of him, the rational part that had spent 35 years teaching American literature at DePaul University, analyzing texts, breaking down narratives into their component parts, knew this was impossible. Camilla was dead. He'd identified her body at the morgue. He'd selected her casket. He'd stood in Crown Hill Cemetery in Wheat Ridge and watched them lower her into the ground next to Marta. He'd spent 4 years learning to live with the empty spaces they'd left behind. But another part of him, a part that lived deeper than reason, that existed in the realm of hope and desperate longing, that part was already moving toward the bedroom door. Because what if? What if somehow, against every law of nature and logic, what if Camilla was out there? What if she needed him and he failed her by being too rational, too skeptical, too afraid of looking foolish or crazy? The hallway was dark. He didn't turn on the lights. His feet found the stairs automatically, muscle memory guiding him down the 13 steps to the first floor. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked steadily, marking time with its brass pendulum. It was 1:07 a.m. according to its face. He could see the front door from the bottom of the stairs, solid oak, painted dark green, with a brass deadbolt and chain lock. Both were engaged. He always locked up before bed, a habit Marta had insisted on when they first moved to the city from a small town in Indiana back when Chicago felt dangerous and unknown. He approached the door slowly. Through the frosted glass panel at the top, he could make out vague shapes. The porch, the railing, the street beyond, nothing else. He stood there, his hand on the cold brass doorknob, feeling the weight of the decision. Open it or don't. Confirm or deny. Step into madness or stay in the safety of grief. That's when the phone rang again. The sound made him jump. The cordless phone in the kitchen started its electronic warble, echoing through the quiet house. He turned away from the door, moving toward the sound. The kitchen was bathed in the blue glow of the digital clock on the microwave. 1:09 a.m. He grabbed the phone from its cradle. "Hello?" Again, that voice. Stronger this time, more urgent. "Daddy, please, I know you're there. I saw you at the window. Why won't you open the door?" His vision blurred. Tears were coming before he could stop them. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Camila. Baby, is that really you?" There was a pause. He could hear breathing on the other end. Shallow, rapid. Then, "Remember what Mama used to say? When I couldn't sleep?" Another pause. She'd say, Las estrellas te están cuidando, mi amor. The stars are watching over you, my love. You'd both say it together, and I'd fall asleep feeling safe. The phone slipped in his grip. That phrase, that exact phrase. It wasn't something they'd ever shared outside the family. It was Marta's invention, a combination of her Mexican heritage and the English words she'd learned when she came to Chicago at 21. She'd said it to Camilla every night from the time she was a baby until she was old enough to want to seem grown up. Even then, sometimes, when Camilla was troubled or sick, Marta would whisper it to her before bed. Nobody else knew that phrase. Not Teresa next door. Not Rogelio. Not any of Andres's colleagues from the university. It was a secret language of their small family, a password to the intimacy they'd shared. How do you know that? His voice was barely a whisper. Because I'm your daughter, Daddy. I'm Camilla, and I'm so cold. Please let me in. I don't understand what's happening, but I'm scared and I need you. The desperation in her voice broke something in him. The analytical part of his brain was screaming warnings, throwing up red flags, demanding he think clearly. But the father in him, the part that had protected and loved this child from the moment she was born, that part was already moving. He was walking back to the front door, the phone still pressed to his ear. "Where are you right now?" he asked. "Tell me exactly where you are." "I'm on the porch, right outside the front door. I can see the mat that says welcome. I can see the potted plant on the right side, the one that's dying because you forget to water it." He looked through the frosted glass. He couldn't see clearly enough to confirm or deny. His hand went to the deadbolt. The metal was cold under his fingers.
"I'm going to open the door," he said. "Stay right there." "Okay, Daddy, hurry, please hurry." He turned the deadbolt. The mechanism clicked. He slid the chain lock free. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples, hear it in his ears. This was it, the moment of truth. Either his daughter would be standing there, somehow returned to him through a miracle he couldn't explain,
or he would confirm what he already knew, that grief had finally cracked him open and his mind was playing cruel tricks. He opened the door. Cold air rushed in. November in Chicago, the temperature already dropping toward freezing. The porch light was off. He'd forgotten to turn it on before bed, another sign of how his routines had deteriorated. He could make out the shapes of his front yard, the bare oak tree near the sidewalk, the empty street. The porch itself was shadowed, dark. There was no one there. He stepped out onto the porch. The wooden boards were icy under his bare feet. He looked left, right, checked the shadows near the railing. Nothing, no figure, no daughter, no Camilla, standing in her winter coat, shivering and needing rescue. The phone was still in his hand. He brought it back to his ear. The line was dead. She'd hung up, or the connection had dropped, or she'd never been there at all. He stood there in the cold for a long time, long enough that his feet went numb and his breath came out in clouds, long enough that Teresa's dog started barking next door, sensing something wrong, long enough that he started to understand, with a sick certainty settling in his stomach, that he'd just crossed a line. He'd just done something he couldn't undo or explain away. He'd opened the door to his dead daughter's voice, and in doing so, he'd opened a door inside himself, one that led to places he wasn't sure he could come back from. When he finally went back inside, locking the door behind him with shaking hands, he knew that everything had changed. The life he'd been living for 4 years, the careful routine of grief management he'd constructed, the fragile peace he'd made with loss, all of it had just shattered. Because now he had a question that wouldn't let him rest. Was he losing his mind, or had something impossible just reached out to him from beyond death itself? And more terrifying than either option was this: he wanted it to be real. God help him, he wanted Camilla to call again. He wanted to hear her voice, even if it meant his sanity, even if it meant accepting something that couldn't exist. Because 4 years of loneliness and grief and empty rooms had taught him that reality without her was harder to bear than any delusion. You might think you know what's happening here. You might think this is simple, a grieving father, hallucinating, a cruel prank, a coincidence. But it's not that simple, because this phone call wasn't the end. It was the trigger for a war between reality and impossibility, between what Andres knew and what he felt, between the rational world and the desperate hope that death wasn't final. To render a fair verdict, you can't just look at the crime scene, the open door, the answered phone. You have to understand the motive, and the motive started years ago in the kind of love that builds families and the kind of loss that destroys them. What Andres didn't know yet was that this betrayal, if that's what it was, went deeper than just strange phone calls in the night. Before this story ends, there will be letters from the dead, confrontations with the living, and choices that half of you will call desperate faith, and the other half will call dangerous delusion. Was Andres right to open that door? Hold that thought. Let's go back to the beginning, to the very first moment that set all of this in motion. To understand where he ended up, you need to see where he started, back when his family was whole, back when Camilla was alive, and the house on the north side of Chicago was full of the ordinary magic of daily life, back before the phone calls, back before everything fell apart. Andres Ordóñez met Marta Salazar in the spring of 1979 in the reading room of the Chicago Public Library's Harold Washington branch. He was 23, a graduate student at the University of Chicago, working on his master's thesis about the influence of magical realism in contemporary American fiction. She was 21, recently arrived from Guadalajara, working as a seamstress during the day and taking English classes at night, determined to build a life in this cold, overwhelming city that felt nothing like home. He noticed her because she was reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Spanish, making notes in the margins with a pencil, completely absorbed. The spring sunlight coming through the tall windows caught in her dark hair, and when she looked up and caught him staring, she smiled. Not a shy smile, a knowing one, like she'd expected him to notice and was amused that it had taken him so long. "You like Marquez?" he asked, walking over before he could second-guess himself. "I love Marquez," she replied, in accented but confident English. "But I think he's better in Spanish. Some things don't translate." They talked for 2 hours, about literature, about Chicago, about the strange loneliness of being surrounded by millions of people and still feeling isolated. When the library closed at 8, he walked her to the bus stop. She gave him her phone number, written on a scrap of paper torn from her notebook. 3 days later, they had their first date at a Mexican restaurant in Pilsen. 6 months after that, they were married in a small ceremony at St. Pius Church, with his parents driving up from Indiana and her sister flying in from Mexico. The early years were hard but happy. Andres finished his degree and started teaching at DePaul. Marta worked at a bridal shop, her skill with a needle earning her a reputation among Chicago's brides. They rented a tiny apartment in Logan Square, saved every penny they could. In 1983, they had enough for a down payment on the house on the north side, a 3-bedroom Victorian that needed work but had good bones, and a backyard big enough for the children they planned to have. Camilla was born in December of 1984 during the first real snowstorm of the season. Andres drove through whiteout conditions to get Marta to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, his hands clenched on the steering wheel, terrified he'd crash or get stuck. But they made it. And at 3:47 a.m. on December 18th, his daughter came into the world, screaming with fury at the cold and the light. When the nurse placed her in his arms, she stopped crying and looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed impossibly aware. In that moment, everything changed. He understood with a clarity that felt religious that his life now had a purpose beyond himself. They were happy, not in the Facebook-filtered highlight reel way, but in the real, complicated, deeply textured way that actual families are happy. There were arguments about money, about Marta working too much, about Andres bringing too much work home from the university. There were worries when Camilla struggled with reading in 2nd grade, relief when she caught up by 3rd. There were summer vacations driving to Indiana to see his parents, winter holidays with Marta's family, flying up from Mexico, filling the house with Spanish and laughter and tamales. Looking back now, Andres could see the patterns, the rhythms they'd established. Sunday mornings, Marta would make breakfast while he and Camilla read the comics section of the Tribune together. Tuesday evenings were family dinners, no exceptions, no matter how busy anyone was. Friday nights in summer, they'd drive to Montrose Beach and walk along the lake, watching the sunset turn the water gold. These routines weren't special, they were ordinary, but that's what made them precious, the accumulation of ordinary days building into a life. Camilla grew up loved and secure. She was smart, graduating near the top of her class at Lincoln Park High School. She loved poetry, like her father. She inherited her mother's skill with her hands, though she used them for painting instead of sewing. She was kind. Maybe too kind, Marta worried sometimes. The kind of person who couldn't see an injured bird without trying to save it, who gave her lunch money to homeless people, who took on other people's problems as her own. When she was 22 and working on her degree in art therapy at the School of the Art Institute, she met Giuliano Campo. He was 26, a psychology PhD student at Northwestern, handsome and charming and seemingly devoted to her. Andres had reservations. Something about Julian felt too polished, too practiced. The way he answered questions felt rehearsed. The way he looked at Camilla felt possessive rather than loving. But Marta told him he was being overprotective, seeing problems where there weren't any. And Camilla was clearly happy. She glowed when she talked about Julian. She laughed more. She was planning a future. They married in 2007, a small wedding in the backyard of the house on the north side. Andres walked her down the makeshift aisle between rows of folding chairs, past friends and family, toward Julian, waiting under an arch, covered in white roses. When he placed her hand in Julian's, he felt a pang of loss. Not grief, not yet. Just the bittersweet recognition that she belonged to someone else now. That his role was changing, shrinking. He was no longer the primary man in her life. The years that followed were good. Julian finished his PhD and started a private practice, specializing in trauma therapy. Camilla got her degree and began working at a community center in Humboldt Park doing art therapy with at-risk youth. They bought a condo in Ukrainian village. They talked about having kids soon. Everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. The story was following the script. Happy family, successful children, grandchildren on the horizon. And then, on March 12, 2020, everything stopped. Marta had a stroke in her sleep. Andres woke up at 6 a.m. to find her next to him, still warm but not breathing. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. A massive hemorrhage. The doctors said she likely didn't feel anything, didn't know what was happening. That was supposed to be comforting. It wasn't. She was 62 years old. They'd had plans. Travel to Mexico, visit her hometown, show Andres where she'd grown up. Retire in a few years, spend more time with Camilla, spoil the grandchildren they hoped were coming. All of it gone in one night. The grief was crushing, physical, like being buried under something too heavy to lift. Camilla moved back home for 2 months to help him function. She made sure he ate, did his laundry, got him to leave the house. Julian came over too, offering his professional insight, suggesting therapists Andres could see. But Andres refused. He didn't want to talk to a stranger about the hole in his life. He wanted Marta back. Since he couldn't have that, he wanted to be left alone. By June, Camilla went back to her own place. Andres tried to return to normal. He taught his classes via Zoom. He graded papers. He went through the motions. But the house felt wrong without Marta. Every room echoed with her absence. The kitchen where she'd cooked. The bedroom where they'd slept for 37 years. The back porch where they'd sat on summer evenings drinking wine and talking about nothing important. He started to see Camilla less. Not intentionally. It just happened. She was busy with work. The pandemic made everything complicated. Julian's practice was overwhelmed with patients dealing with lockdown stress. Weeks would go by between visits. They talked on the phone, but it wasn't the same. He could hear in her voice that she was worried about him, but he didn't know how to reassure her without lying. Then, on October the 4th, 2020, 6 months and 3 weeks after Marta died, Andres got a call from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. There had been an accident, a car crash on the Kennedy Expressway. The rain had been heavy, visibility was poor. A semi-truck jackknifed. Camilla's car was caught in the resulting pileup. She died instantly, they told him. No suffering, just like Marta. As if that mattered, as if the absence of pain at the end somehow balanced the infinite pain left behind. This time, Julian fell apart. At the funeral, he was barely functional, sedated, speaking in monotones. Andres found himself in the strange position of comforting his son-in-law, while his own grief was still fresh from Marta. They held each other at the cemetery, two men who'd lost the center of their worlds, united in incomprehensible loss. The months after Camilla's death blurred together. Andres stopped teaching, took a leave of absence that turned into early retirement. He stopped answering the phone unless it was Julian, who called once a week to check in. Stopped answering the door unless it was Teresa delivering casseroles she'd made, leaving them on the porch with a kind note. He existed in the house like a ghost himself, moving through rooms that held too many memories, sleeping in the guest bedroom because he couldn't bear to be in the bed where Marta had died, eating at odd hours, losing track of days. The isolation of the pandemic made it worse. Everyone was alone, so his particular aloneness didn't stand out. He could disappear into grief without anyone noticing because the whole world was grieving. That's where he'd been living for 4 years, in a kind of suspended animation, not quite alive, not quite dead, going through the rhythms of existence without participating in life. The friends he'd had from the university stopped calling, his colleagues retired or moved on, his neighbors remained polite but distant. Even Julian's weekly calls had dwindled to monthly, then every few months. Not from cruelty, just from the natural way people move forward while you stay frozen. The house deteriorated around him. Small things at first, the lawn getting overgrown, paint peeling on the porch railing, the potted plant by the front door, a succulent Camilla had given him, slowly dying from neglect. Then, bigger things, a leak in the bathroom he didn't fix, gutters clogging because he didn't clean them, the refrigerator making a rattling sound that he ignored. He told himself he'd deal with it all eventually. But eventually never came. Because what was the point? Who was he maintaining this house for? It was too big for one person, too full of ghosts, too painful to be in and too painful to leave. Looking back now, if Andres was honest with himself, there had been signs. Small ones. Easy to miss. Or maybe not easy to miss. Maybe he'd chosen not to see them because seeing meant questioning things he didn't want to question, like the way Julian had started pulling away about a year before the accident. The way his visits became shorter, his excuses more frequent. Work was busy. He had a lot of patience. He was tired. All of it reasonable, all of it probably true, but underneath there had been a distance, a coolness that hadn't been there before. Or the way Camilla had seemed troubled in those last months. The way she'd sometimes start to say something, then stop. The way she'd look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between sadness and apology. He'd asked if everything was okay. She'd always said yes. But now, thinking back, he wondered if she'd been trying to tell him something. If she'd been carrying a weight she didn't know how to share. And there was something else. Something that had bothered him at the time, but that he'd pushed away because it seemed paranoid. In the weeks after Camilla's funeral, when he'd been going through her things, boxing up her art supplies and clothes to donate, he'd found a journal. He'd started to read it, then stopped. It felt like an invasion. She was dead, but her privacy still mattered. He'd put it in a box in the attic, told himself he'd read it someday, when he was ready. He never got ready. The box sat in the attic, along with all the other pieces of his family's life he couldn't bear to sort through. Marta's clothes, Camilla's paintings, photo albums, Christmas decorations they'd never use again. All of it packed away, out of sight, but not out of mind. That was the baseline. A man living in a house full of memories, isolated by grief and the peculiar loneliness that comes from being the last one left. Everything seemed fine in the way that a life can seem fine when you've lowered your expectations enough. Normal, manageable, until that phone call at 1 a.m. shattered the fragile equilibrium he'd built and forced him to face the possibility that nothing about his situation was fine or normal or manageable. The question he should have been asking but wasn't was this: why now? Why, after 4 years of silence and grief and routine, did his daughter's voice suddenly appear? What had changed? What had shifted to make this moment the one where the impossible became real, or where his mind finally cracked under the weight of loss? He didn't know, couldn't know, but sitting in his kitchen at 1:30 in the morning, after locking the door and confirming there was no one on the porch, after standing in the cold until his feet were numb, he felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Something other than grief. It was fear. Deep, primal, the kind that comes from realizing you can't trust your own senses, the kind that makes you understand that reality is more fragile than you thought, held together by agreements and conventions that can break at any moment. And underneath the fear was something worse, something he didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't deny. It was hope, desperate, irrational hope that maybe somehow his daughter had reached out to him from wherever she was. That death wasn't the end. That love was strong enough to bridge the impossible gap. That he might get one more chance to hear her voice, to tell her he loved her, to say the things he hadn't said when she was alive. That hope was dangerous. He knew it was dangerous, but he couldn't kill it. It had taken root in the moment he heard her voice, and now it was growing, spreading through the empty spaces inside him like ivy through abandoned buildings. And that's where things stood when he finally went back to bed at 2 a.m., lying awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the phone to ring again. Because it would ring again. He knew it would. He could feel it with a certainty that bypassed logic. His daughter had called. She'd asked him to let her in. He'd opened the door and found nothing. But that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The first move in a game whose rules he didn't understand, played by forces he couldn't see, with stakes he was only beginning to comprehend. And whatever happened next, whatever choice he made, whatever path he took, there would be no going back. The door was open now, literally and metaphorically, and something was coming through. Whether it was salvation or destruction, sanity or madness, he couldn't say. But it was coming, and he would have to face it. You tell me, was he right to open that door? Should he have left it locked, ignored the voice, protected himself from whatever this was? Or was opening it the only thing a father could do, given the circumstances? Hold on to that question, because what happened in the days after made the answer a lot more complicated than you might think. Andres didn't sleep that night. He lay in the guest bedroom, staring at patterns the streetlight made on the ceiling through the blinds, listening to every sound the house made. The furnace clicking on, the ice maker in the kitchen dropping cubes into its bin, the branches of the oak tree scratching against the siding when the wind picked up. Every noise made him tense, made him wonder if it was her. If Camilla was somehow in the house, moving through rooms, trying to make contact. At some point near dawn, he must have dozed off because he woke with a start to sunlight streaming through the window and his phone buzzing on the nightstand. Not the landline, his cell phone. He grabbed it, heart racing, but it was just a text from Teresa next door, asking if he needed anything from the store. He typed back, "No, thank you," and set the phone down, feeling the crash of disappointment. Part of him had hoped, irrationally, that it would be Camilla somehow. A text from the dead. He got up, showered, went through the morning routine on autopilot. Made coffee. Tried to eat toast, but couldn't get past 2 bites. The kitchen felt too bright, too normal. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday, but everything was different because he was different. The phone call had split his life into before and after, and he was living in the after now, trying to figure out what the rules were. By 10 a.m., he couldn't stand being in the house anymore. He needed air, needed to move. He put on his coat and walked to Crown Hill Cemetery, a 20-minute walk through neighborhoods that were slowly gentrifying, old bungalows being renovated by young families who could afford the rising prices. The cemetery was quiet on a Tuesday morning in November. A few other visitors scattered among the graves. A groundskeeper on a riding mower in the distance. He found Marta and Camilla's graves easily. He'd been here enough times over the 4 years. They were buried side by side under a maple tree that was now bare for winter. The headstones were simple granite, just names and dates. Marta Teresa Salazar Ordóñez, 1958-2020. Camila Rosa Ordóñez, 1984-2020. Beloved wife and mother, beloved daughter and wife. Words that couldn't possibly capture who they were, but were all that remained above ground. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, looking at his wife's name and his daughter's name carved into stone. He wanted to talk to them, to ask Marta what was happening to him, to ask Camilla if it had really been her on the phone. But the words wouldn't come. The graves were just graves. Pieces of granite marking places where bodies were buried. There was no presence here, no sense of them, just absence, carved into stone and grass. "I might be losing my mind," he finally said out loud, his voice cracking. "I heard her, Marta. I heard Camilla last night on the phone. She sounded real. She knew things only she would know. And I opened the door. I actually opened the door expecting to see her standing there." The wind moved through the bare branches. A crow cawed somewhere nearby. That was all. If I'm going crazy, I wish you could tell me. I wish you could send me some kind of sign that I'm not. That this isn't real. Because if it was real, if she really called me, then I don't know what that means. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. He waited as if expecting an answer. The rational part of his brain, the part that had taught literary analysis for 35 years,
knew how ridiculous this was. Dead people don't answer. Graves are silent. Hoping for signs from the deceased was a function of grief, not reality. But the irrational part, the part that was growing stronger since last night, wanted desperately to believe something would happen. A bird would land on Camilla's headstone. A specific cloud would form. Something, anything.
To confirm he wasn't alone in this. Nothing happened. The morning stayed ordinary. The cemetery remained a cemetery. He walked home slowly, taking the long route through the park. His phone rang when he was crossing Montrose Avenue. The landline this time forwarded to his cell. He looked at the caller ID. Unknown number. His hand shook as he answered it. Hello? Silence. No, not silence. Breathing. Faint, like someone far away. Camilla. His voice was barely a whisper. Is that you? Daddy. The voice again, clearer now in the daylight, still unmistakably hers. You came looking for me. His legs went weak. He sat down hard on a park bench. Where are you? What's happening? I don't understand. I don't understand either. I'm confused.
Everything is dark and cold and I can't find my way. But I can feel you when you're close. I felt you this morning at the cemetery. His heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst. How is this possible? Camilla, you died 4 years ago. I was at your funeral. I buried you. A pause, then in a smaller voice. I know, I remember. The rain, the car sliding, the impact.
Everything going dark. But then I was somewhere else, somewhere in between. And I've been trying to reach you, trying to find my way back. Back to what? I don't know. Home? Life? I just know I'm lost and scared and I need you. Her voice broke. Please don't stop believing me. Please don't think I'm not real. You're the only one who can hear me. I won't, he said quickly. I promise.
I believe you. Just tell me what to do. How can I help you? I don't know yet. But stay close. Keep listening. There's something I need to tell you. Something important. About why I died. It wasn't just an accident, Daddy. There's more to it. But I can't remember everything clearly. It's like looking through fog. I need time. I need you to be patient and keep listening when I call.
About why you died? What do you mean it wasn't an accident? Static crackled on the line. Her voice started to fade. I have to go. It's hard to stay connected, but I'll call again. Soon, I promise. I love you, Daddy. Las estrellas te están cuidando, mi amor. The line went dead. Andres sat on the bench for the next hour, phone clutched in his hand, oblivious to the cold seeping through his coat, to the people walking by giving him concerned looks. His mind was reeling. She'd said it wasn't just an accident, implied there was something suspicious about her death, something he didn't know. But that was impossible. The police had investigated. It was a weather-related pileup, multiple vehicles, bad visibility, tragic but straightforward, wasn't it? He tried to remember the details from 4 years ago, the hospital calling, the drive through the rain to Northwestern Memorial, the police officer who'd spoken to him, a young woman with kind eyes who'd explained about the semi-truck jackknifing, the chain reaction of collisions. She'd shown him photos of the damage. Camilla's car was crushed between 2 larger vehicles. The officer had been clear. Death was instantaneous. No chance of survival. No one was at fault. it was an act of God or nature or just terrible luck. But Camilla was saying something different, or the voice that sounded like Camilla, because that was the question he still couldn't answer. Was he really talking to his dead daughter's spirit? Or was his grief-broken mind conjuring elaborate hallucinations, complete with perfect voice replication and intimate knowledge? He walked home, made himself eat something, tried to read, but couldn't focus on the words. The afternoon dragged. He kept checking his phone, hoping for another call, dreading another call. What would he do if she called again? What if she gave him specific information about her death, information he could verify? That would make it real, wouldn't it? That would prove this wasn't just his imagination. At 6 p.m., Julian called. Andres almost didn't answer. He didn't know what to say to his son-in-law about the phone calls. How do you tell someone their dead wife has been calling you? But he answered on the fourth ring, trying to keep his voice normal. Andres, hey, just checking in. Haven't talked to you in a few weeks. How are you doing? I'm fine. Managing. The lie came automatically. Good. Listen, I wanted to run something by you. I'm thinking of selling the condo, Camilla's and my place. It's been 4 years and I still can't bring myself to go through her things, pack everything up. And living there alone, surrounded by memories, it's not healthy. My therapist thinks I should move on, literally and figuratively. Andres felt a spike of something, anger, suspicion. That's your decision to make. It was your home. I know, but I wanted to tell you first, out of respect, and also to ask if you want any of her things before I donate most of it. Her art supplies, paintings, clothes. I know it's painful, but I thought maybe you'd want something. Yes. The word came out more forcefully than he intended. Yes, I want her things. Don't donate anything without letting me go through it first. A pause on the other end. Of course. I wasn't going to, I just meant eventually. Are you sure you're okay? You sound tense. I'm fine, it's been a hard few days. Anything specific? You know you can talk to me. I might be a therapist, but I'm also family. Andres almost told him then, almost said, Your dead wife called me last night. She says her death wasn't an accident. She's trying to tell me something, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Julian had said, move on. Maybe it was 4 years of distance and infrequent calls. Maybe it was Camilla's voice in his head, saying, You're the only one who can hear me. As if this was meant to be private, as if telling anyone else would break whatever fragile connection existed. Just the normal stuff, he said instead. Grief, loneliness, the usual. They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. Julian's practice, the weather. When they hung up, Andres felt exhausted. The conversation had required energy he didn't have, maintaining normalcy when everything felt abnormal. That night, he sat in the living room with all the lights on, the landline phone on the coffee table in front of him, waiting. He told himself he should be scared, should be questioning his sanity, should call a doctor or a therapist or someone. But instead, he felt alert, almost excited. Because if Camilla called again, he'd be ready. He'd ask better questions. He'd get more information. He'd figure out what she needed, what she meant about her death not being an accident. The phone didn't ring that night. He waited until 3 a.m. before finally going to bed, disappointed and relieved in equal measure. Maybe it was over. Maybe the calls would stop and life would return to its previous state of manageable grief. But he knew, even as he tried to convince himself, that it wasn't over. This was just beginning. Something had been set in motion, and now he had to see it through to whatever end was coming. He fell asleep around 4 a.m. and dreamed of Camilla as a child, 5 years old, holding his hand as they walked through the museum. In the dream, she kept trying to tell him something important, pulling on his hand, pointing at things he couldn't see. He kept telling her to wait, that he'd listen in a minute, but then she'd disappear into the crowd and he'd panic, searching for her, calling her name. When he finally found her, she'd look at him with sad eyes and say, "You never listen, Daddy. You never listen when it matters." He woke with a jolt, heart racing, the dream so vivid he could still feel the texture of her small hand in his. Sunlight was streaming through the curtains. It was Wednesday morning. The house was silent except for the usual sounds. No phone ringing, no voice calling from the shadows. But there was something different. Something that made him freeze when he walked into the kitchen. On the table, where he'd left nothing the night before, was a single sheet of paper, folded in half. His hands shook as he picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable, Camilla's. The distinctive way she made her capital letters, the slight slant to the right. He'd seen this handwriting on birthday cards, grocery lists, post-it notes stuck to the refrigerator. The note was dated October the 2nd, 2020, 2 days before her death, and it said, "Dad, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I need you to know the truth about Julian. He's not who you think he is. I found out things, bad things."
About where his money comes from, about his past, about why he really married me. I'm scared. I've been too scared to tell you in person because I don't know who to trust anymore. But you need to know. Check the safety deposit box at First National Bank. Box 847. The key is in my jewelry box, the one Mom gave me. Inside the box are documents, evidence. If I'm gone, you have to see them.
You have to know what I knew. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I'm sorry for everything. I love you. Always your Camila. Andres read the note 3 times, each time more slowly, his brain trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. This was a note from his daughter, written 4 years ago, appearing on his kitchen table overnight. How? How was this physically possible? Unless he'd written it himself, in some kind of fugue state, sleepwalking or something, copying her handwriting from memory, creating evidence to support the delusion that she was communicating with him. But he looked at the paper closely. It was old, slightly yellowed. The fold lines were worn like it had been folded and unfolded multiple times over years. The ink was faded in places. This wasn't a fresh note. This was years old. And he hadn't written it. He knew he hadn't, which meant someone had put it here. Someone had come into his house while he slept and left this note for him to find. Or Camilla had. His dead daughter had somehow manifested enough to leave a physical note. His rational mind rejected both possibilities. But the note was real. He was holding it. The handwriting was real. The date was real. 2 days before the accident that killed her. And the contents were explosive. She was scared. She'd found something out about Julian. Bad things, about money, about his past, about why he married her. Andres felt something cold settling in his chest. The phone calls were one thing. Hallucinations, maybe, grief-induced breaks from reality. But this was physical evidence. A note he could touch, could show to other people, could have examined by handwriting experts. This changed everything. He thought about Julian's call yesterday, about selling the condo, getting rid of Camilla's things, moving on. What if that wasn't about grief? What if it was about covering something up, removing evidence before anyone could find it? And the safety deposit box, box 847 at First National Bank, the key in her jewelry box, that was specific, verifiable. He could check. He could go to the bank and see if the box existed, if there was a key, If there were documents inside, like Camilla said, that would prove something, though what exactly he wasn't sure. It would prove the note was real, that Camilla had written it, but not necessarily that she'd been the one to put it on his kitchen table last night. He needed to think. Needed to figure out what to do. Call the police and tell them what? That his dead daughter left him a note accusing her widower of something unspecified. They'd think he was crazy, probably do a wellness check, maybe try to commit him for psychiatric evaluation, tell Julian, confront him directly? But if there was really something sinister going on, if Camilla's death hadn't been an accident, then warning Julian would be dangerous and stupid. No, the smart thing was to investigate quietly. Find the jewelry box, find the key, go to the bank, see what was in the safety deposit box, get the evidence first, then decide what to do with it. But even as he made this plan, part of his brain was screaming at him. This was insane. He was following instructions from a ghost, building an investigation based on a note that had appeared supernaturally, going down a path that would only lead to looking more unstable, more detached from reality. Yet he couldn't ignore it. The note was here. Real. Tangible. And it aligned with what the voice on the phone had said. It wasn't just an accident. There's more to it. This was the more. This was what Camilla needed him to know. He folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket. Then he went upstairs to the guest bedroom, to the closet where he'd stored boxes of Camilla's things after the funeral. Julian had given him some items, things he couldn't bear to keep at the condo. Photo albums, some of her favorite paintings, jewelry. The boxes were stacked in the back of the closet, covered with a layer of dust. He hadn't opened them in 4 years. He pulled them out now, one by one, until he found the one labeled personal items. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was the jewelry box. Dark wood, inlaid with mother of pearl, about the size of a shoebox. It had been Marta's, given to Camilla on her 16th birthday. He remembered the day, Camilla's face lighting up. Marta explaining that it had belonged to her mother, brought from Mexico, passed down through generations. Now it was Camilla's responsibility to care for it, to eventually pass it to her own daughter someday. Except there would be no daughter, no passing down. The chain of inheritance had ended with Camilla's death. He opened the box. Inside were necklaces, earrings, bracelets. Not expensive stuff. Camilla hadn't cared about jewelry much, mostly sentimental pieces. A locket with photos of Marta and Andres. A silver bracelet Julian had given her on their first anniversary. A pair of pearl earrings that had been Marta's. And underneath everything, in a small compartment at the bottom, a key. Small, brass, with a number stamped on it, 847. Andres held the key up to the light. It was real. This was all real. Camilla had written that note. She had hidden this key. She had rented a safety deposit box and filled it with evidence of... what? What had she found out about Julian? What had scared her enough to write a note to her father, to hide documents, to take precautions in case something happened to her? And then something had happened. An accident on a rainy night, a chain reaction of collisions, bad luck and bad timing. Or maybe not luck at all. Maybe something else. Something deliberate. The thought made him sick, but once it was in his head, he couldn't shake it. What if Camilla's death hadn't been an accident? What if someone had arranged it, made it look like bad weather and bad timing? Julian was a psychologist. He was smart. He knew how to manipulate people, how to read them, how to stay calm under pressure. Those were skills that could be used for good or for other purposes. But why? Why would Julian want to kill his own wife? For money? For freedom? to hide whatever Camilla had found out about him. The note mentioned money. Where his money comes from. Julian had a successful practice, but Andres didn't know much about his finances. He'd never asked. It hadn't seemed relevant. But now he wondered. How did a young psychologist afford a nice condo in Ukrainian village? Afford a new car every few years? Afford the lifestyle he'd been living? Andres looked at the clock. 9:37 a.m. The bank would be open. He could go now, present the key, access the box, see what Camilla had left for him. But something made him hesitate. If Julian really was involved in something bad, if he'd really hurt Camilla, then he might be monitoring Andres, watching to see if he did anything suspicious. Going to the bank might alert him, but the alternative was worse. Sitting in the house, doing nothing, while evidence sat in a box at the bank. Evidence that might explain everything. That might prove Camilla's death wasn't an accident. That might bring justice for her, even 4 years late. He made his decision. He'd go to the bank, but he'd be careful. He'd watch for anyone following him. He'd act normal, casual, just a man running errands. And he wouldn't tell anyone where he was going or what he'd found. Not yet. Not until he knew what he was dealing with. He put the jewelry box back, hid the note in a book on his shelf, slipped the key into his pocket. Then he got dressed, put on his coat, and headed out into the cold November morning. The sky was overcast, threatening snow. The temperature had dropped overnight. His breath came out in clouds as he walked to his car, a 10-year-old Honda that he barely drove anymore. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes. He kept checking his rearview mirror, looking for cars that might be following. But the morning traffic was normal, random vehicles going random places. No one seemed interested in him. The bank was in a strip mall on Western Avenue. He parked, took a deep breath, and went inside. The interior was bland corporate decor, beige walls, fake plants, motivational posters about savings and retirement. A young teller at the counter looked up and smiled. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" "I need to access a safety deposit box." "Of course. Do you have your key?" He showed her the key. She examined the number, typed something into her computer, then looked up with a slightly confused expression. "Box 847 is registered to Camilla Ordóñez. Are you related?" "I'm her father. She passed away 4 years ago." The teller's expression softened. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Unfortunately, I can't give you access without proper documentation. You'd need proof that you're the executor of her estate or have power of attorney. Do you have anything like that?" Andres felt panic rising. He hadn't thought about documentation, hadn't considered that he couldn't just walk in and open the box. "I'm her next of kin. I'm her father. She left me the key." "I understand, sir, and I'm sympathetic, but we have protocols. If you can bring in her death certificate, proof of your relationship, and documentation showing you have legal authority to access her property, we can help you. Otherwise, my hands are tied." He wanted to argue, wanted to explain about the note, about the phone calls, about needing to see what was in that box. But he knew it would sound insane, and it would draw attention. The last thing he needed was bank security being called. "How long would it take to get the documentation together?" "That depends on you. The death certificate you probably already have. Proof of relationship could be a birth certificate or similar. The legal authority would need to come from probate court or an estate attorney. If her estate was settled, there should be records. Could take a few days to a few weeks, depending on how organized everything is." Andres nodded slowly. "Thank you. I'll come back with the proper paperwork." He left the bank feeling frustrated and defeated. 4 years ago, he'd been so deep in grief that he'd let Julian handle most of Camilla's affairs, the estate, the legal details. He'd signed papers without reading them carefully. trusting his son-in-law to manage things appropriately. Now he wondered what he'd signed, what authority he'd given away, what access he'd lost. When he got home, he went straight to his file cabinet, digging through old folders until he found the one labeled Camilla Estate. Inside were copies of documents from the probate process. He read through them carefully, his anger building with each page. Julian had been named executor of Camilla's will. Julian had distributed her assets, which were minimal. Most everything she owned had gone to him as her surviving spouse. Andres had received some personal items, some photos. That was it. He'd signed off on the arrangement without objection because he'd been too broken to care about money or property. But now he saw the problem. Julian had legal control over Camilla's things, including, presumably, her safety deposit box. If Andres went through official channels to gain access, Julian would be notified. He'd know what Andres was looking for. And if there really was damaging evidence in that box, evidence that implicated Julian in something criminal, he'd have time to remove it or destroy it. This was a trap. Camilla had left him the key and the information, but the system itself prevented him from accessing what he needed without alerting the one person who might have something to hide. Unless he didn't go through official channels. Unless he found another way. He sat at his kitchen table, the key in his hand, thinking through options. None of them were good. All of them required breaking rules or taking risks he wasn't equipped for. He was a retired literature professor, not a detective or a criminal. He didn't know how to navigate situations like this. The phone rang, the landline. He looked at the caller ID, unknown number. His hand shook as he answered. "Hello? Daddy, did you find the note?" Camilla's voice, clear and close, like she was in the next room. "Yes, I found it, and the key, but I can't get into the box. The bank won't let me without documentation, and if I go through official channels, Julian will find out." "I know, I'm sorry. I didn't think about that when I wrote the note. I was scared, and I just wanted to make sure you'd know the truth if anything happened to me, but there's another way." "What way?" "The documents in the box. I made copies. I hid them somewhere else. Somewhere safer. Somewhere only you and I would know about." His heart skipped. "Where?" "Remember when I was 12? When we had that fight because I didn't want to go to summer camp, and I ran away for the afternoon to prove I could take care of myself?" He did remember. It had been a terrible day. Camilla had been going through a difficult phase, pushing boundaries, testing them. She'd gotten angry about being sent to camp and had disappeared for 6 hours. He and Marta had been frantic, calling friends, driving around the neighborhood. They'd finally found her at the place they should have checked first. "The treehouse," he said. "The treehouse.
I hid there that day, and you found me, and we had a long talk about trust and family. You made me promise I'd never hide from you again. That no matter what happened, I'd come to you with my problems." His eyes burned. "I remember. I broke that promise, Daddy. When I found out about Julian, I should have come to you immediately. But I was ashamed, embarrassed that I'd married someone who turned out to be what he is. So I tried to handle it myself. And look where that got me." "Don't say that. Whatever happened, it's not your fault. Maybe not, but the copies are there, in the treehouse. In the metal box we used to store our treasures when I was little. Remember that box?" He did. An old cookie tin they'd found at a garage sale. Camilla had decorated it with stickers and used it to store special things. Interesting rocks, bird feathers, little toys. The treehouse itself was still in the backyard, though he hadn't been up there in years.
It was falling apart, probably dangerous. But if the box was still there, if the documents were still inside... "I'll check tonight," he said. "After dark. I don't want anyone seeing me. Be careful. If Julian suspects you know something, he might try to... I don't know. Just be careful. He's not who you think he is. He's not who I thought he was. Promise me you'll be smart about this. I promise. Camilla, I need to know your death, the accident. Was it really an accident?" A long pause, then quietly.
"I don't know for certain. My memories are confused, but I know I was scared. I know I was planning to leave him. And I know that 2 days after I hid those documents, I was dead. Maybe that's a coincidence. Maybe it's not. But you'll know more when you read what I found. It's all there. The truth about who Julian Ocampo really is. Okay, I'll get the documents. And then what?"
Then you decide what to do. Whether to go to the police, whether to confront him, whether to just protect yourself and let it go. I can't tell you what to do, but you'll have the truth. That's all I can give you now. The truth. Finally. The line went dead. Andres sat there, phone in hand, staring at nothing. The treehouse. Of course, it made perfect sense. The place where she'd hidden as a child, the place that represented safety and secrets and the bond between father and daughter. That's where she'd hidden the most important secret of all. He spent the rest of the day preparing. Made sure he had a flashlight, that it had good batteries, found his old work gloves in case the treehouse ladder was rough or unstable, tried to eat dinner but couldn't. His stomach was too tight, too knotted with anticipation and fear. At 8 p.m., when it was fully dark and the neighbors' houses showed only the glow of TVs behind curtains, he went out to the backyard. The tree house was at the far end, built into the oak tree near the fence. He and Camilla had built it together when she was 8. A simple platform with walls and a roof, accessed by a ladder nailed to the trunk. It had been her castle, her fortress, her private world. As she got older, she'd used it less, eventually abandoning it entirely in her teenage years. But it remained, weathered and worn, a monument to her childhood. He tested the ladder carefully. Some of the rungs were loose, but it held his weight. He climbed slowly, the flashlight held between his teeth, his hands gripping the wood. The platform creaked when he pulled himself up, but it didn't collapse. Inside, everything was dusty and full of cobwebs. He could barely stand, had to crouch under the low roof. The cookie tin was in the corner, right where Camilla said it would be. The stickers were faded but still visible. A unicorn, a rainbow, a star. He opened the tin. Inside, under layers of old treasures, was a manila envelope, sealed, thick with papers inside. He took it, climbed back down, and went inside the house. He locked all the doors, closed all the curtains, then sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. What he found inside changed everything. There were bank statements, transactions showing large deposits into Julian's accounts, hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years, from sources listed only as consulting fees and private investments. But the amounts were too large, too regular. This wasn't normal income for a psychologist in private practice. There were emails, printed copies of correspondence between Julian and people whose names Andres didn't recognize. The language was vague but suggestive. The shipment arrives Thursday. Make sure the distribution stays quiet. We can't afford attention from authorities. It read like the communication of criminals discussing illegal activities. There were photos, surveillance-style images, grainy and taken from a distance. Julian meeting with rough-looking men in parking lots, Julian at locations that looked like warehouses or industrial areas, Julian accepting packages from people who definitely didn't look like psychology patients. and there was a summary document written by Camilla in her own handwriting, dated September 30th, 2020, 4 days before her death. It laid out what she'd discovered, that Julian wasn't just a psychologist, that he was involved in something illegal, possibly drug distribution, using his practice as a front, that he'd married her partly for cover to appear more legitimate, less suspicious, that when she'd confronted him about the strange income, about the secrets he was keeping, he'd become threatening, not physically violent, but cold, telling her she didn't understand what she was getting involved in, that if she told anyone, if she went to the police, there would be consequences. Not just for him, but for her, for Andres, for everyone she cared about. She'd been terrified. She'd gathered evidence quietly, planning to take it to the authorities after she left him. But she'd never gotten the chance, because 2 days after she hid these documents in the treehouse, she died in what was officially ruled an accident. Andres read through everything 3 times. Each pass made him angrier, sicker. His daughter had been married to a criminal, had been threatened by him, had died under suspicious circumstances while in possession of evidence that could destroy him. And Andres had known nothing, had spent 4 years grieving while Julian continued his life, continued his crimes, unpunished and unsuspected. The question now was what to do. The evidence was old, 4 years old, possibly too old to prosecute. And without Camilla to testify, to explain how she'd gathered it, it might not even be admissible in court. A good lawyer could argue it was fabricated, taken out of context, unreliable. But it was something. It was truth. And it demanded action. Andres looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Too late to call anyone. Too late to go anywhere. He'd have to wait until morning, decide then whether to go to the police, hire a lawyer, or confront Julian directly. Each option had risks. Each could backfire. But doing nothing was no longer possible. Not now that he knew. He gathered the documents carefully, put them back in the envelope, and hid them in a new location. Not the obvious place. Somewhere Julian would never think to look if he somehow got into the house. Then Andres sat in the dark living room, watching the street through a crack in the curtains, waiting for morning, trying to decide how to move forward. The phone rang at 12:03 a.m. He answered it before the second ring. "Did you find them?" Camilla's voice. "Yes, I found them. All of it. Camilla, this is dangerous. This is evidence of serious crimes. Julian could go to prison. And if he finds out I have this..." "I know. That's why you have to be smart. You have to protect yourself. Maybe you should talk to a lawyer first. Someone who can advise you on how to proceed safely." "I will. First thing in the morning. But I need to ask you something. Your death, the accident. Do you remember anything unusual about that day? Anything that might suggest it wasn't just bad luck?" A long silence. Then, "I remember fighting with Julian that morning. One of our worst fights. I told him I was leaving, that I couldn't live with his lies anymore. He'd been calm, too calm, and he'd said something strange. He said, 'You should be careful, Camilla. You don't know what you're risking.' And at the time, I thought he meant I'd be risking financial security or social consequences, but now, looking back, maybe he meant something else." "What else do you remember?" "The drive. I was upset, crying. The rain was heavy, but I've driven in worse. And then there was a car behind me, riding close, too close. I remember feeling nervous about it, changing lanes to let them pass. But they changed lanes too, stayed right behind me, almost like they were following me. What kind of car? I don't know. SUV, maybe. It was dark and rainy, and I wasn't paying attention to details.
I just remember feeling uncomfortable, and then the semi-truck ahead started to jackknife, and everything happened so fast. The SUV behind me, I don't know if they hit me or if I hit the truck first. Everything's confused after that. Pain and darkness and then nothing. Andres felt ice in his veins. Someone was following you. Someone ran you off the road or into the path of the truck.
Maybe. Or maybe I'm just finding patterns in random chaos because I want there to be a reason. Because accepting it was just an accident feels worse somehow than believing someone killed me deliberately. At least then there's a villain. Someone to blame. If Julian arranged your death, he's a murderer. And he's been free for 4 years. Living his life. Selling your condo. Moving on. While you're dead. While I'm dead, yes. That's the reality, Daddy. I'm dead, and he's alive, and the evidence you have might not be enough to prove anything. But it's something. It's a start. Please be careful with it. Please don't let him know you're suspicious until you're ready to act. I won't, I promise. I love you. And I'm sorry. Sorry for all of this. Sorry I didn't come to you sooner when I was alive. Sorry you're having to deal with this now. Don't be sorry. I'm glad I know. Better to know the truth than live with comfortable lies. Maybe. We'll see if you still feel that way after this is over. Good night, Daddy. Las estrellas te están cuidando. Las estrellas te están cuidando, mi amor. The line went dead. Andres sat in the dark, holding the phone, trying to process everything. His daughter's voice, the documents, the implications. If this was real, if Camilla really was somehow reaching out to him from beyond death, then he had a responsibility to her memory, to justice, to truth. But if it wasn't real, if this was all elaborate delusion constructed by his grief-broken mind, then he was about to destroy what remained of his life. Accuse his son-in-law of murder based on evidence that might be misinterpreted, documents that Camilla could have gathered for innocent reasons. A death that was investigated and ruled accidental by professionals. The rational part of his brain said to be cautious. Talk to a lawyer, get professional advice. Make sure he wasn't making a mistake. The emotional part wanted immediate action, wanted to confront Julian, wanted justice for Camilla right now. He decided to compromise. He'd talk to a lawyer first thing in the morning, show them the evidence, get their professional opinion on whether it was enough to take to the police. And then he'd decide, based on what they said, that was smart, that was careful. That was what Camilla would want him to do. He finally went to bed around 2 a.m. but didn't sleep much. Every sound made him jump. Every creak of the house settling made him wonder if someone was breaking in. If Julian somehow knew what Andres had found and was coming to silence him the way he might have silenced Camilla. The rational part of his brain said this was paranoia. The emotional part said paranoia might be justified. Morning came slowly. Grey light filtering through curtains. The sounds of neighbors starting their days. Cars on the street, dogs barking. Normal life continuing while Andres's world had tilted into something abnormal and dangerous. He got up, made coffee, tried to focus. Found a criminal defense attorney in the phone book. Someone with good reviews and experience with complex cases. Called their office at 9 a.m. sharp. I need to speak with someone about evidence in a possible murder case, he told the receptionist. I can schedule you for a consultation. Is this regarding charges against you? No, I'm bringing evidence about someone else. It's complicated. I'd rather explain in person. They gave him an appointment for that afternoon at 2 p.m., 4 hours away. He spent the time organizing the documents, making notes about what Camilla had told him on the phone. When he wrote it all down, it looked insane. Conversations with his dead daughter, instructions from beyond the grave. But the documents were real. The evidence existed independent of how he'd found it. That's what mattered. At 1:30, he got in his car and started driving toward the attorney's office downtown. He checked his rearview mirror obsessively, watching for cars that might be following. But the afternoon traffic was typical, random vehicles going random places. He was probably being paranoid. Then he noticed it, a black SUV, 3 cars back, that had been behind him since he left his neighborhood. When he changed lanes, it changed lanes. When he took an unexpected turn onto a side street, it took the same turn. His heart started racing. This was real. Someone was following him. He pulled over, suddenly parking in a loading zone. The SUV drove past, and he got a glimpse of the driver. Male, wearing sunglasses, baseball cap pulled low. Could have been anyone. Could have been no one. Maybe he was seeing threats that weren't there. He waited 5 minutes, then pulled back into traffic. The SUV was gone. He didn't see it again for the rest of the drive. By the time he reached the attorney's office, he'd half convinced himself he'd imagined it. Stress and lack of sleep creating false patterns. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Morrison, listened to his story with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. She examined the documents carefully, asked questions about how he'd obtained them, about the phone calls, about Camilla's death. When he finished explaining everything, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Ordóñez, I'm going to be frank with you. This evidence is interesting but problematic. The financial records show unusual income, but that alone doesn't prove criminal activity. He could argue they're legitimate consulting fees. The emails are vague enough to have innocent explanations. The photos don't show anything explicitly illegal, and the summary written by your daughter is hearsay. Without her here to testify about how she gathered this information and what it means, it's just allegations. So there's nothing we can do? I didn't say that. I think there's enough here to warrant investigation, but you need to understand, going to the police with this, especially with the story about your daughter's ghost helping you find evidence, could backfire badly. They might think you're unstable. They might think you fabricated the documents yourself to frame your son-in-law. And if word gets back to Julian that you're making accusations and if he really is involved in criminal activity, that could put you in danger. So what do you recommend? I recommend we hire a private investigator, someone who can look into Julian's background discreetly, verify the information in these documents, see if there's current illegal activity that could be documented, build a case that doesn't rely on 4-year-old evidence and supernatural communication. If the PI finds something solid, then we go to the police with a complete package, something they can't dismiss or ignore. It made sense, it was smart, but it also meant waiting, more time passing while Julian remained free. More risk that he'd discover what Andres was doing and take action to protect himself. How long would an investigation take? Depends what they find. Could be weeks, could be months. I know that's not what you want to hear, but building a case properly takes time. Andres nodded slowly. He didn't have a better option. Going to the police now with what he had would likely lead nowhere. Okay, let's do it. Hire an investigator. Do whatever you need to do. They spent another hour going over details, signing agreements, discussing costs. The consultation and investigation would be expensive, draining a good portion of his retirement savings. But what else did he have to spend money on? If this brought justice for Camilla, it was worth any amount. When he left the attorney's office, it was after 4 p.m. The sun was already setting, the days short this time of year. He drove home carefully, still checking for followers, but seeing nothing suspicious. Maybe the SUV earlier had been coincidence. Maybe he was letting paranoia control him. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a moment, gathering himself. This was happening. He was really doing this. Investigating his son-in-law. accusing him of crimes, possibly putting himself in danger. All based on phone calls from his dead daughter and documents hidden in a treehouse. If someone had told him a week ago this would be his life, he would have laughed or cried. Hard to say which. He got out of the car and walked toward his front door. That's when he noticed it. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, barely visible unless you were looking for it. But he always locked his door, always. It was habit, automatic. He knew with absolute certainty that he'd locked it when he left for the attorney's office. Someone had been in his house. Someone had broken in while he was gone, or was still inside. Now you tell me, you've heard the setup, you've seen the evidence. A man receives phone calls from his dead daughter. He finds a note, discovers documents hidden in a treehouse, learns his son-in-law might be a criminal who possibly murdered his wife. And now someone has broken into his house while he was talking to a lawyer about investigating. Is this a grief-driven delusion? Is Andres creating an elaborate fantasy to cope with unbearable loss? Or is something genuinely sinister happening? Is Camilla really reaching out from beyond death to warn him? Is Giuliano Campo a murderer who's been living free for 4 years? You're the jury. Keep those questions in your mind, because what happens next will test everything you think you know about reality, about justice, about the line between helping a grieving man and enabling dangerous paranoia. The evidence is mounting, the stakes are rising, and Andres is about to make a choice that will change everything. But before we see that choice, before we watch him step through that open door into whatever's waiting inside, you need to understand the psychological machinery underneath this whole situation. Because whether this is real or delusion, whether Camilla is a ghost or a creation of Andres' traumatized mind, there are mechanisms at work here. Patterns of thinking and behavior that explain how someone goes from ordinary grief to believing they're receiving calls from the dead. And more importantly, if Julian really is what those documents suggest, then there are manipulation tactics at play. Techniques used by predators to control victims, to avoid detection, to maintain their cover while committing crimes. You need to understand those tactics to judge this case fairly. So before we continue with the story, before we see what Andres finds inside his house and what choice he makes, let's pause. Let's examine the psychology. Let's decode what's happening beneath the surface, give you the vocabulary to understand not just what's happening, but why. Because you're not just listening to a story, you're analyzing a case, and to render a verdict, you need more than facts. You need to understand the human machinery that turns facts into action, that turns grief into ghosts, that turns criminals into family members who seem perfectly normal. Ready? Then let's expose the mechanisms underneath this drama. You've heard the story. You feel the confusion, maybe the anger at Julian, maybe the concern for Andres. But do you know exactly what happened to your brain just now? Do you understand the psychological weapons that have been deployed, whether by a clever criminal or by Andres's own grief-damaged mind? Let's not treat this like a classroom lesson. This is a forensic psychological autopsy. We're going to dissect the machinery of what you just witnessed, reveal the hidden gears and levers, give you the power to see what most people miss. The primary psychological weapon at work here is called traumatic grief response, sometimes known as complicated grief or persistent complex bereavement disorder. But those clinical terms don't capture what's really happening. Let me break it down mechanically, show you how it works, like a 3-step glitch in reality. Step 1. The brain refuses loss. When you lose someone suddenly, especially someone central to your existence, your brain doesn't accept it, can't accept it, because acceptance means rewiring thousands of neural pathways, updating millions of memories, restructuring your entire sense of self and future. That's too much work, too much pain. So the brain looks for shortcuts. It creates what psychologists call continuing bonds, the sense that the deceased person is still present in some form. For most people, this is mild. You smell your dead mother's perfume and feel comforted. You hear a song your dead friend loved and feel their presence. These are normal, healthy ways of maintaining connection while processing loss. But for some people, especially those who experience the loss traumatically, without warning, without goodbye, the continuing bond becomes more intense, more literal. The brain doesn't just sense presence, it manufactures presence, voices, visions, experiences that feel absolutely real, because to the brain, they are real. Step 2. Pattern recognition goes haywire. Your brain is a pattern-finding machine. That's its job, to identify connections, predict outcomes, keep you safe. When you're in acute grief, especially complicated grief, that pattern finding goes into overdrive. You start seeing connections everywhere. Coincidences become signs. Random events become messages. A dream about your daughter means she's trying to communicate. A note you forgot you had means she left it for you supernaturally. This isn't stupidity or weakness. It's your brain trying desperately to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. Death is chaos, randomness, the ultimate loss of control. So the brain creates order, creates a narrative where the death wasn't random, where the deceased isn't really gone, where there's still a way to connect and communicate. It's protective in its intent, even if it's destructive in its effect. Step 3. Confirmation. Bias locks it in. Once your brain has constructed this narrative, once you believe your daughter is calling you from beyond death, every piece of evidence supports that belief. The voice sounds like her. Proof it's real. The voice knows things only she would know. More proof. The phone rings at significant times. Even more proof. But what about all the evidence against it? The physical impossibility, the lack of scientific support, the alternative explanations? Your brain filters those out, literally doesn't process them, because acknowledging them means destroying the narrative, returning to chaos, facing the unbearable reality that she's gone and not coming back. Now let's go back to the beginning of Andres' story. Point 2, where everything seemed normal. Remember when Julian started pulling away a year before the accident? When his visits got shorter, his excuses more frequent. At the time, it looked like a busy professional dealing with work stress. But that wasn't an accident. That was step 1 of the weapon, isolation. When predators, whether they're abusers or criminals or manipulators, want to control a situation, they start by isolating their victims from support systems. They do it slowly, subtly. They don't demand cut off your family. They just gradually become less available, less engaged, creating distance that seems natural. So when the victim eventually discovers something wrong, when Camilla found those financial records, she was already isolated, already in a position where she couldn't easily reach out for help. And remember how Camilla seemed troubled in those last months, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. That wasn't shyness or uncertainty. That was the result of what psychologists call coercive control. Julian had created an environment where Camilla felt afraid to speak up. Not through violence necessarily, but through subtle threats, through demonstrations of power, through making her believe that revealing his secrets would lead to consequences she couldn't handle. Think about what the note said. I'm scared. I don't know who to trust anymore. That's not the language of someone who discovered something and planned to report it. That's the language of someone who's been systematically broken down, made to doubt their own judgment, isolated from support, and threatened into silence. Julian wasn't just committing crimes. He was using advanced psychological manipulation to ensure his victim couldn't or wouldn't expose him. And when that didn't work, when Camilla gathered evidence anyway, when she planned to leave and take her information to authorities, what happened? She died. In what was ruled an accident. But was it? Look at the timing. Look at the fight that morning where Julianne told her, "You should be careful." Look at the SUV that followed her in the rain. Look at the convenient jackknifed semi-truck that provided cover for what could have been deliberate action to run her off the road. I'm not saying definitively that Julianne killed Camilla, but I am saying the pattern fits. And when you combine traumatic manipulation with convenient death, you get a situation where the victim's father, 4 years later, is so desperate for answers, so broken by loss, that his brain creates a narrative where his daughter can still communicate, can still guide him, can still seek justice from beyond the grave. That's the synthesis, that's where the two concepts meet. Andres's complicated grief response makes him vulnerable to believing impossible things. And if Julianne really is a predator who killed Camilla, then Andres's investigation, prompted by what he thinks are supernatural communications, might actually be the first real threat Julianne has faced in 4 years. The grief creates the motivation. The belief in ghostly communication creates the justification, and the actual evidence and the real documents Camilla left behind creates the means. When you combine a weaponized grief response with sophisticated predatory manipulation, you don't get a relationship, you don't even get a crime, you get a hostage situation that extends beyond death, where the victim's father becomes the proxy for her stolen voice, whether or not he's actually hearing that voice supernaturally. Now let's talk about red flags, the warning signs that appear early but only make sense in hindsight. The patterns that, if you know what to look for, predict disaster almost mathematically. See, we usually only see red flags in the rearview mirror. We look back after the relationship has imploded or the crime has been committed and say, "Oh, that was a sign." But what if you could recognize them in real time? What if you could see the pattern unfolding and intervene before the worst happens? Let's give you that power. Red flag 1. The too perfect beginning. Go back to when Andres described meeting Julianne, handsome and charming and seemingly devoted. Those first two are neutral. The third is the problem. Seemingly devoted. That's Andres's gut instinct, noticed at the time but dismissed, that something about Julianne's devotion felt performed rather than genuine. Here's how to distinguish real devotion from performed devotion. Real devotion is inconsistent. It has bad days, it gets tired and irritable, it's human. Performed devotion is always on, it's too smooth, too polished, it responds perfectly to every situation, it knows exactly what to say and when to say it. That's not love, that's a sales technique. That's someone who's studied what love looks like and is mimicking it for a purpose. At the beginning of the story, when Camilla met Julianne, he gave her exactly what she needed. The perfect boyfriend who said the perfect things. That wasn't luck, that was calculation. He'd assessed what she wanted, what would hook her, and he delivered it flawlessly. Too flawlessly. Real people stumble, real people are awkward, real people reveal their flaws and vulnerabilities gradually. Predators don't, not until the hook is set. If you see this in your own life, pause, ask yourself, is this person perfectly attuned to me because we have genuine chemistry, or because they're performing a role? The test is simple. Do they have consistent values and behavior with everyone, or do they change significantly depending on who they're with? If they're one person with you and a completely different person with their friends or co-workers, that's not adaptability. That's shape-shifting, and shapeshifters are predators. Red flag 2, the isolation that feels like priority. Remember how Julianne gradually pulled away from family events? How his visits to Andres got less frequent, his calls less regular? At the time, it looked like a busy career taking priority. And that's how isolation always looks at first, Like the predator is choosing you, prioritizing you, wanting you to themselves. We don't need anyone else, we have each other. But healthy relationships expand your world. They add people to your life, not subtract them. When someone is isolating you, they do it under the guise of deepening your bond. They make it seem like intimacy, like special connection. I just want time alone with you. Your family doesn't understand you like I do. We're so much happier when it's just us. The crucial distinction is agency. Are you choosing to spend more time with this person because you genuinely want to? Or are you feeling obligated, feeling like seeing other people would upset them, feeling guilty when you maintain other relationships? That guilt is the tell. That's the red flag waving. In Camilla's case, by the time she discovered Julian's secrets, she was already isolated enough that she didn't immediately tell her father. She wrote a note. She hid evidence. She tried to handle it herself. That's what isolation does. It makes you feel like you have to face problems alone, like reaching out for help would be betrayal or weakness. And that's exactly what predators want. Victims who don't ask for help are much easier to control or eliminate. Red flag 3. The reality distortion field. This is the most dangerous flag, the one that does the most damage. It's when someone consistently describes reality differently than you experienced it, and does it with such confidence that you start doubting your own perception. Look at how Julian responded when Camilla confronted him about the suspicious income. According to her note, he didn't explain, he didn't justify, he told her she didn't understand what she was getting involved in. That's not an answer. That's a deflection paired with intimidation. It shifts the problem from his behavior to her perception. The message is, the problem isn't what I did, the problem is that you're questioning me. And this technique, often called gaslighting, though it's broader than that term implies, works by creating a constant low-level confusion. You know what you saw, but they tell you you're wrong. You know how you feel, but they tell you you're overreacting. You know what happened, but they reframe it until you're not sure anymore. Over time, this destroys your confidence in your own judgment. You become dependent on them to tell you what's real, what's reasonable, what's acceptable. The counter-move is documentation. When someone consistently describes events differently than you remember them, start keeping records. Write down what happened immediately after it happens. Save texts and emails. Create a paper trail that you can refer back to when they try to rewrite history. Your written records, created in the moment, are more reliable than memory. And when you can look at them and confirm, no, I'm not crazy, this is what really happened, you break the power of the reality distortion. Red flag 4. The escalating control that feels like care. The note mentioned Julian threatening consequences if Camilla went to the police. Not direct threats of violence, but vague implications of danger. There would be consequences, not just for him, but for her, for Andres, for everyone she cared about. That's not concern, that's control masked as protection. Predators often frame their control as care. I'm not trying to control you, I'm trying to keep you safe. I'm not limiting you, I'm protecting you from making mistakes. I'm not threatening you, I'm warning you about what others might do. It's a brilliant manipulation because it makes you feel like resisting them is selfish, like asserting your autonomy is putting yourself and others at risk. The way to see through this is to ask, who benefits? If the protection primarily benefits you, it might be genuine care. If it primarily benefits them, by keeping you silent or compliant or dependent, it's control. Julian telling Camilla not to go to the police didn't protect her. It protected him. The threat to her and her family was coming from him or his associates, not from some external force. But by framing it as a warning rather than a threat, he made her feel like he was looking out for her interests when he was actually defending his own. Red flag. 5. The convenient death. This is the ultimate red flag, the one that transforms everything that came before from concerning to potentially criminal. When someone who poses a threat to a predator dies suddenly, conveniently, in circumstances that are ambiguous enough to be ruled accidental, you have to examine it carefully. Look at the timeline. Camilla hides evidence. 2 days later, she fights with Julian and tells him she's leaving. That same day, she dies in a car accident. On the surface, it's tragic coincidence, but look deeper. She was followed by an SUV in the rain. She was run into the path of a jackknifed truck. The circumstances created plausible deniability, a way to kill her that would look like weather and bad luck. I'm not saying every accident that follows a threat is murder, but I am saying that when the timing is that convenient, when the circumstances are that ambiguous, when the person who died was in possession of damaging information, you have to investigate. You have to assume it could be deliberate until you can prove otherwise, because predators count on people assuming the best. They count on investigators seeing an accident and not looking further. They count on the natural human instinct to accept tragic randomness rather than confront evil calculation. So now you have the tools. You know what complicated grief response looks like and how it can make someone vulnerable to believing impossible things. You know what predatory manipulation looks like and how it operates through isolation, reality distortion, and coercive control. You know the 5 major red flags that, if you see them early enough, can help you or someone you love avoid the trap entirely. But there's still a question we haven't answered, the question at the heart of this whole case. Is Andres really receiving calls from Camilla's ghost? Or is his grief creating an elaborate hallucination that happens to align with real evidence she left behind? Here's what I think. And I want to be careful here, because I'm about to give you my interpretation, and you should absolutely disagree with me if your analysis leads elsewhere. That's what being a jury member means, thinking independently. I think the calls are grief. I think Andres's brain, broken by traumatic loss, isolated by pandemic and social withdrawal, desperate for connection and meaning, constructed a narrative where Camilla can still communicate. Every call is his subconscious mind processing information he already had access to, but hadn't consciously assembled. The note wasn't placed on his table supernaturally. He found it while going through Camilla's things, and his traumatized brain blocked the memory, then revealed it to him in a way that felt supernatural. The instructions about the treehouse weren't from a ghost. They were from his own memory of where Camilla hid as a child, surfacing in a moment of desperate need. But here's what makes this complicated. Even if the ghost isn't real, the evidence is. Camilla really did gather documents about Julian's illegal activities. She really did hide them. She really was scared and planning to leave. And she really died under suspicious circumstances 2 days later. So whether Andres is being guided by supernatural forces or by his own subconscious processing of real information, he's stumbled onto something true, something that needs investigation, something that might actually bring justice for his daughter, even if his route to discovering it was through delusion rather than detective work. That's the moral complexity. That's where you, the jury, have to make a decision. Is it ethical to support Andres's investigation when it's motivated by belief in ghost communications? Or is that enabling a dangerous mental health crisis that could end in him making false accusations, destroying relationships, or putting himself in genuine danger from people who don't exist? On one hand, if Julian really is a criminal, if he really did kill Camilla or arrange her death, then Andres's investigation is not just justified, but necessary. Even if his motivation comes from grief-induced delusion, the outcome could be genuine justice. Sometimes people arrive at truth through illogical paths. Sometimes reality and delusion align in ways that produce good results despite flawed reasoning. On the other hand, If the evidence is misinterpreted, if Julian's suspicious income and vague emails have innocent explanations, if Camilla's death really was just tragic accident, then Andres is destroying his remaining family relationships and his own mental health based on ghost stories. And that's a tragedy compounding tragedy. That's grief becoming destruction. So you have the facts. You have the story in its completeness. You have the psychological framework to understand what mechanisms are at work. You have the red flags to identify what went wrong and when. Now it's time for the verdict. The case I'm presenting to you is this. Andres Ordóñez, 68 years old, grieving the loss of his wife and daughter, begins receiving phone calls he believes are from his deceased daughter's spirit. These calls lead him to discover evidence suggesting his son-in-law, Julian, is involved in criminal activity and may have arranged Camilla's death. Andres hires an attorney and private investigator to build a case against Julian, despite the fact that his entire investigation is motivated by supernatural communications that almost certainly aren't real. The question before you, is Andres justified in pursuing this investigation? Is he a grieving father following legitimate leads, even if his path to finding them was through delusion? Or is he a mentally unstable man making dangerous accusations based on ghost stories, creating problems where none exist and potentially putting himself at risk? Some of you will say he's justified, that the evidence, however he found it, deserves investigation, that Julian's behavior, the suspicious finances, the convenient death, all of it adds up to something that needs looking into. That even if Camilla's ghost isn't real, her warnings were, and Andres is just now hearing them. That sometimes justice requires irrational faith, requires believing impossible things, requires following intuition over logic. Others will say he's not justified, that he needs psychiatric help, not a private investigator. That building a case based on ghost communications is inherently unsound, that he's likely misinterpreting evidence, seeing patterns that don't exist, constructing conspiracy where there's only coincidence, that the kindest thing would be to get him medical support, help him process his grief properly, prevent him from making accusations that could destroy his relationship with Julian and ruin his own credibility. And some of you will land in the middle, will say that he should investigate but carefully, should gather more evidence before making accusations, should acknowledge that his motivation might be delusion while still following through on what he's discovered, should protect his mental health while also protecting his daughter's memory and pursuing truth wherever it leads. I'm not going to tell you which position is right. That's not my job. My job was to present the case completely, to give you the tools to analyze it fairly and to step back while you deliberate. But I will say this. In cases like these where grief and possible crime intersect, where mental health and justice overlap, where supernatural belief and real evidence coexist, there are rarely clean answers. Reality is messy. Human psychology is complicated. And sometimes the right thing to do is unclear until long after you've already had to choose. Andres is standing at his front door right now, in our story. It's slightly open. Someone's been in his house. He has to decide whether to go inside to see what they took or left, to continue down this path. And you have to decide whether you'd support that choice or try to stop him. The gavel is yours. The verdict is yours. The comment section is open. I want to know what you think. Not just NTA or YTA or ESH. I want your reasoning. I want you to engage with the complexity. I want you to be the jury this case deserves. Because that's what we do here at Cozy Jury. We don't give easy answers. We present hard questions. We trust you to think deeply, to consider multiple perspectives, to arrive at conclusions that reflect your own moral framework rather than accept mine. So tell me, is Andres Ordóñez justified in pursuing this investigation? Should he walk through that open door, or should he step back, call for help, admit he might be losing his grip on reality? You decide. You've heard everything. The full story, the psychological framework, the evidence for and against. Now it's your turn. The fire's burning low, the case is closed for presentation, but deliberation is just beginning, and I'll be in the comments reading every verdict, every argument, every perspective you bring. Thank you for being here, for thinking with me, for taking this seriously enough to engage rather than just react. Court is adjourned, but the conversation continues. See you in the comments.